For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Berg. I'm the executive director here at the Art Center, and we're pretty excited about this event. A little bit how it started was that I think Sandy and I had a conversation on Facebook, and we were like,
well, even before that, Laura and I went into
Yeah.
and Sarah was there, and Terry, we did a little trial run to see what it was about.
Yep. So storytelling events are pretty popular, and they're getting more popular out places that are less populated, right? Because just because you live in a place that there's less people doesn't mean you should have less things to do, or that you have less stories to tell. So like a lot of events out here, it's a community art center. So if you have an idea or you have something that you think would be fun to try out, you should come to the Art Center and pitch it, right? And then if you even have the legs to help put it on, it gets moved to the front of the list sometimes. So that's how that works. Now I'm going to kind of turn it over to our Masters of Ceremonies. A lot of you might know her. If you don't know her, you should get to know her. She's pretty cool. Her name is Laura Asay.
Welcome, glad you're here. We are story people. I think we tell stories because that's how we make sense of the world and who we are in the world and how we function. Now I could have you turn and talk to the people next to you, and I could give you instructions and say, I want you to tell 3 fact-based things about yourself that you want someone else to know. And then you would do that, and you would both come up with your sassiest 3 points that you wanted to make, or the safest, right? And then you'd share those things, and I suppose in 2 minutes or so we'd be done. But then if I said, now I want you to turn and tell a story about a time when, or instead of saying, tell 3 things about your family, then I would say, tell a story about being a brother or a sister, or tell a story about traveling with family, or tell a story about a holiday. Then I think we'd have to, ring a bell to get you to be quiet eventually, because those stories are far beyond listing interesting things about yourself. And I think in a world that is more and more divided, or so it seems, I think we forget that on a basic human level, we are connected. We are connected through those stories. And through telling those stories, we find those connections. Even with the most unlikely people, we're going to find something that we share in common through telling each other our stories. And I think telling stories is more and more important because I think so many other people want to tell us who we are and what we think. And we know that. We know who we are. And we know what we think. And then the cool thing is that when you share your story with another person, who you are and what you think might actually change a little bit, might shift. I think kind of the world depends on your idea about yourself and the world shifting. I think we need that to happen. And so we gather together today because we are story people. We have stories just waiting to be told and help us make sense of things and to remind us that we are connected. So we kind of wanted to lay some groundwork for today about storytelling. First of all, everyone is invited to tell a story, but not everyone is required. So if you have any anxiety about that, just take a deep breath. We just wanted to open the floor for storytelling, for anyone to tell their story. And then for you to know that we are with you in this room. This is not an antagonistic room. This isn't a storytelling competition. This is not about being the funniest or the most meaningful or the most whatever. This is about telling your story. And then you have everyone in this room is with you because everyone's terrified of public speaking, right? Yeah, so we're going to be pulling for you no matter what. And so we want this to be a safe space for you to know that whatever story you're going to tell should be reflective of who you are, should come just straight from the ground of you, and that it's going to fall on good ears here, that we will be with you in your storytelling. If you suddenly think of a question that you have for the storyteller in the midst of their story, just save it for the end. Just because as a person who talks for a living and a lot, sometimes if you get interrupted, it's hard to get back on that train again. And so we'll take a breath after each story. And if you have a question that you really wanted to ask the storyteller, we'll make space for it then. I think that's it. So are you ready to either hear or tell some stories? Great. Yeah. Yes, we are. You know, the cool thing is I don't have an intimidating microphone to shove in your face. And so you just come up here if you have a story to tell and tell it. Is there anyone that wants to start our storytelling time? Orville, right? Come on up.
My name is Orville Moe, and some of you may have seen some of my writings in the local Leader. I do that somewhat irregularly, but I do contribute to the opinion section. And I thought it might be kind of interesting to talk about the name Orville. And I don't know exactly what my folks were thinking of back in 1935 when I was born. I'm 82 now, so I do have a collection of stories. But one of the things that I learned was that my father and my uncle were very interested in aviation. And of course, very interested in Orville Wright, who was the big name in the 30s. And so I had an interesting opportunity to actually meet Orville Wright back in 1945 when I was 10 years old. Now he lived to be quite an elderly man, and he died in 1948. And the event that was being honored at the time, my uncle had something to do with it because he worked for Douglas Aircraft in California. And they were delivering the very first DC-4, which is a 4-engine aircraft, to Northwest Airlines in Minneapolis. And as a result of that delivery, they had invited Orville Wright to come because he was associated with the Wright-Patterson engines that were now on, the 4 engines that were now on that aircraft. And it was also the first commercial plane that had a wingspan of 117 feet. And the Wright brothers, the Wright first flight was about 112 feet, if I recall correctly. So we had an airplane that was with a wingspan of more than the first flight. And so my father, you know, was involved with well, he was in the restaurant business, but he was involved with the airlines, and so was my uncle. So he dragged me along, you know, and as we were waiting in line, of course, Orville Wright was now in a wheelchair in his elderly, early 70s or late 60s. He came by and was talking to various people, including our family. And he said, hello. And I said, hello, my name's Orville. And he said, well, mine is too. And so not many people alive today, I think, can say they've actually met one of the founders of the flight, you know, first flight family. So that was basically the story I have for you, and I'll make it short and somebody else can do it.
Well, my name is Haley Jacobson, and I'm a magician. So my origin story was born out of curiosity and the need for attention, because I was raised with 4 sisters, I'm the middle child, and I'm a twin. So we were raised in the country. Our nearest neighbors were 2 miles and about 50 years older than us. So we really only had each other and our television. In all of our home videos, our living room television set is always on. And there is video of us talking about these television characters as if they are real people and our friends. Once I hit elementary school, my mother returned to work and we became latchkey kids. So we'd get off the bus at about 3:45 p.m., rifle through the mail, and of course we'd lose it. Sorry, Dad. And then we'd catch the last 15 minutes of Bill Nye the Science Guy, who's my first celebrity crush, by the way. 4 p.m. was the Magic School Bus, and then it was prime time, people. It was time for Arthur, my favorite television show. One afternoon, my father came home and said, "We're gonna go get a big screen TV, everybody get in the truck." This was the moment. I was going to see what the rest of Arthur's house looked like, because a bigger screen meant a wider shot, right? 4:30 p.m. the next day, I watch Arthur, and I didn't see any more of Arthur's house than I did the day before. So something wasn't right. This wasn't making any sense. How did television work, and was Arthur even real? I became so enamored with television. How did it work? How did film work? That my parents would have to pull me away from the screen or shut the television off altogether to get my attention. Every week I saved up to go see a new film in theaters. I couldn't believe people are living their lives in my living room, in my town. I wanted to live my life in everybody's living room, in everybody's town. So Christmas 2002, I'm 10 years old. I decide I'm gonna give my parents a movie starring me for their Christmas present. And we'd call it SOS the Pole. I rallied my sisters, and together we saved Christmas. Maybe not the most original plot, but remember, we were 10. And we filmed our movie in sequence, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and there were bloopers along the way, but because we were recording on a VHS camcorder, we couldn't go in and edit. So we'd film our bloopers, we'd reenact them at the end, because we wanted our parents to see just how awesome we were. And I thought that this was how movies were made. I made a movie. This is the magic of cinema. And I was starstruck. So today I know that the magic of cinema is the magic of cinema because it's all an illusion. Scenes are filmed out of sequence in different time zones on different continents. War zones are filmed in high school football fields. We are led to believe through camera angles, movement, and props that Tom Cruise is taller than Katie Holmes. You know, actors stand in front of green screens and dinosaurs and dragons are edited in. Cinema is a sleight of hand. So, no, these people are not living their lives in your living room. A bigger screen does not show you more of Arthur's house. But the connection that you can make is real, with the people, with the landscapes, and the stories. That is the magic of cinema. So you see what the magicians of Hollywood want you to see. Thank you.
I'm Heather Goodrich. I live in Hutchinson now, formerly in Dassel, formerly in Bloomington, formerly in Minneapolis, and formerly in England. And I used to have a tea shop in Dassel Roast Tea Shop, and I have friends who are going to be reopening it possibly early next month. And Terry Kemfert from River of Hope asked me if I'd ever documented my story. I still haven't. But I will just be brief because my story gets rather long. I used to, from the tea shop, we used to do a tea for the Dassel Coquedo English Lit class twice a year for 12 years. And to begin with, I just served scones and cream cakes and PG Tips tea, and told them about the tea shop. And one day, my son used to be with me, my son Cameron, and I don't know why, but I started telling them about me growing up in England during the war. And I have no idea why, I just did. And when I was finished, So Marco, the teacher, asked me, please do that for future, because the young people nowadays, they don't hear those things. And I did 4 days at the charter school, and that's when I met Terry. And I taught those children, not children, young adults, I guess I have to call them, how to make scones, how to make sausage rolls, how to make cream cakes, and how to make sandwiches, finger sandwiches, and how to make good black tea. And I understand you still drink PT tips, Terry? Absolutely. Yeah. And so that is what I have done here, part of what I've done here. I haven't spoken in front of people for a long time. And I grew up in England in 1930. I'm 87. And it was my mother and my dad and me. My father died when I was 7. My mother was 30, he was 32, and I was 7. And shortly after, the war started, and my mother and I were alone during the war. And the area wardens used to watch out for us because they knew we were by ourselves. And the one night that I remember, I'm just going to tell you just a few things. The area warden came to the door and he told my mother, he said, you have a little pinprick in your blind. They were black. And he said, the enemy can see that. And he said, that needs to be fixed, you know. And which we did. But that's just one of the things that you know, happened. And if anybody wants any questions, there's a lot more goes to it. Terry, I think, has heard most of it. So. But that is the beginning of my story. And I came over here. My mother married an American soldier, and I came over with the deal. And I came over on the Queen Mary, and we settled in Buffalo Lake. Traumatic. I mean, the people were wonderful to us. I can't, you know, say anything against that. But I was off through school in England, and Superintendent, Mr. Hofstad, came to see my mother and said, you know, this is a long time ago. This isn't how it is now. And he said, I think Heather needs to get an American diploma. So I went back to high school as a freshman and went through 4 years of high school in Buffalo Lake and graduated all over again. And I had a lot of things happen to me, very interesting things. And I'm not going to go into that now, but that's the beginning of my story. Thank you.
You should hang out at the wine table maybe afterwards. I think we could hear story after story after story. Yeah, it's not too long at all. No, it's not.
Well, I'm Jack Bonnewell. I live here in Hutchinson. I had absolutely no intention of being up here this afternoon. But as my family knows, never give me a chance to be in front of a microphone someplace. It's dangerous. And I can tell you why that probably is, because I was born in Iowa, but raised on the Bonnewell farm out here by Lake Hook. Old District 14 is where I went to school. And I can remember as growing up, there didn't need to be any particular invite for the neighbors to come over in the evening and chat, and play pinochle or whatever, and the guys sit there and tell stories. And these stories, sometimes aided with adult beverages or one thing or another, could grow. Some got a little bigger in life, but some of those stories probably situate or help me form who I am today and help me in forming my opinions in the context with which I make decisions and opinions. And little kids sitting and listening to these stories was a huge impact on me as I look back on it. And I have to think about that once in a while when I do open my mouth, of who's listening to that and what opinions and contexts they may be formulating at the time as we spin these yarns of stories. But one thing that I have taken a formulation of storytelling is how we relate things that happen that are really important in our life. And with that, I'd like to tell you a story about my folks. When my folks retired, maybe some of you knew my dad, Calvin, but he was an avid fisherman, as well as my mother, Margaret. They just loved to go fishing, and they sunfish by the tons over the side of that little 14-foot crestliner boat. They'd pull them in and just had a ball. One evening, apparently, they had been out fishing and they caught a lot of sunfish, and they came home and cleaned them, had a beautiful sunfish meal. My dad and my mother, and the next morning they got up, and my dad was in the kitchen area, and he heard my mother get up, and he looked over to see her walk across the living room area and fall. She collapsed. I get a call from Dr. Bretsky. Dr. Bretsky said, Jack, very matter-of-factly, he says, your mother's had a massive stroke. She's in an ambulance headed for Abbott Northwestern. You need to get your dad down there now. So I got my dad. We took him down to Abbott Northwestern. Now you should know this. Lots of people know she had problems. My mother had problems with heart. She had cancer. She had diabetes. She had lots of things going on. So having a stroke, was quite critical. And when we got up there, things were quite grave. She was on complete life support. And we watched this operation going on in the room for quite a while with all these machines going on. And it wasn't long, and the doctors came in and said, well, your mother is operating at a brainstem level. She is, for all intents and purposes, she has died. She is dead. But she's still on life support. And so we have some decisions to make. With all of her complications, we could keep her on this life support, feeding tubes. We can keep her heart pumping and breathing, or we can do something else. Well, my dad said, I know what she would have in mind. She would not want to live on life support. To let her go. Well, the doctors there said, you don't need to make that decision right now. Why don't you go home and sleep on it? So we did. My brother and I and my dad went home. We slept on it. Got up the next morning. The decision was still there. Her wishes would be, just let her go. So we drove back down to Abbott Northwestern. We got down there. We met with the doctors in charge down there. We said, we made our decision. You can go ahead with this process. So we went into the room. I still remember. We were sitting in comfortable chairs. The doctor came in and said, verified that this was our wishes, and yes. And so we sat there, and one by one, they took off this piece of machinery, and then they took off this piece of machinery, and then they took off the next. And the doctor came in when the last piece was off, and he said, 15, 20 minutes, her breathing is going to change, it's going to rise, it's going to fall, and then stop. So we watched. We watched her breathing rise. Then we watched her breathing fall. And fall. And then it kind of evened out. It kind of evened out. And then it came back a little bit. It came back a little bit. 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour. The doctor came back in and he said, looked at her. Margaret's a tough old bird, isn't she? Yes, indeed. He said, you know, we can't do any more for her here. Let's take her down to her room where she'll be a little more comfortable, and you will be too. So they did. They took her down there, put her in a room. At that point, they did give her some oxygen to live on. And then the nurses came in and said, you know, this has been 3-4 hours. This could go on for some time. Why don't you go home and get some rest? So we did. We went home and got some rest. Came back the next day fully believing that perhaps Mother had passed away. I will shorten the story a bit. This went on for over 2 months. I brought my dad down almost every day. We'd come into the room. We'd walk past the bed, go over, we'd open up the drapes, let some sunlight in. We'd come back over. Dad would sit down alongside of Mother and tell her the news, what's going on. Kind of a one-way visit, but all that time she sat, glassy-eyed, looking straight up. Once in a while, they call it motorcycle syndrome, which they tell me, any nurses here, they tell me that's indicative of brain stem operation of the brain. You're basically brain dead. One morning I came down to the hospital with Dad. Dad went over and sat down. I walked across in front of the bed. I took a look, went over and opened up the shades. I came back, and what I thought I saw going over was her eyes moved to follow me. I walked back in front of the bed, and I thought I saw her eyes follow me back. I went out in the hall, talked to the nurse, and I reported to the nurse what I saw. And the nurse said, you know, Jack, I think I saw that as well. She said, let me call a doctor. She called a doctor. The doctor came down. He went over to her bedside. You know, the deal with the light in her eyes, shined this light in there. He looked at her and he said, Margaret, wake up! She went like that. He said, good morning. She said, good morning. Oh. The doctor looked at her. Oh my, he said. He went out in the hall. Margaret's awake! Yeah, a doctor going out and yelling in the hall. He was just flabbergasted. Within 2 or 3 minutes, doctors were all over that room, trying to figure out where did we miss it. I'll shorten the story some more. This went on for another 2.5 years. She came to the point she could walk. You know those bars that you could stand up on and walk through therapy? She could walk. She ended up feeding herself. She ended up playing pinochle, blackjack, canasta. She loved going to church every Sunday morning. We could get down there. Continued on with a quality of life that she indicated that she enjoyed. We tell stories to tell about our context. How do we make decisions? What experiences do we have, and who relayed those to us? And to me, this experience has really had an impact on my life. Thank you.
So my name is Sarah Shorter, and I was thinking about the origins about this theme, and I realized that my husband and I get a very funny look from people when somebody asks us if we're going on a vacation. We say, yeah, we're going to go to Seattle, or we're going to go to South Carolina with our kids, and people are like, oh, well, where are you flying into? And we say, oh, well, we're driving. And we get these absolute looks of horror from almost everybody we say that to. And almost every time, actually. And people say, you're driving with your children that long distance? And and we always just kind of say, well, yeah, we are, you know. And I was thinking about the origins of where that apparent crazy desire to do that comes from. I come from a large family. There are 5 of us siblings, but we were kind of divided into 2 families. My younger sister and I came a decade beyond the older 3. And so at one point in time, the older 3 were all in college and adult and beyond. And so it was just my younger sister and I vacationing with my parents. And the vacation I remember the absolute best was the summer that we went from South Dakota down to Arizona, up to Seattle, and back. It was a 2-week trip. My dad would get 2 weeks off in the summer. He was a pharmacist. He owned his own business, and he was on call every other night in my hometown to take care of medical stuff. We didn't have a doctor there, and he often would be called in the middle of the night with emergencies and help people figure out if they should call the ambulance or not. And so we took 2 weeks of vacation in the summer, and he liked to drive because he kind of liked to be in control. I have nothing like that in my life behaviors at all. And so he liked to drive. And so we're on this vacation, and we were part camping, tenting, and part hoteling. And by this time, I'm about 11 this year, and my sister's about 9. And so this puts my mother at about 48. I don't think my mother really wanted to go tenting. It was the last time my mother ever slept in a tent in a sleeping bag. It never happened again. And so it wasn't every night in the tent, but we would hotel it part-time and tent it part-time. And of course, this is in the early 80s. And so I don't think you had to necessarily reserve ahead the way you do now. I don't think that was necessarily a requirement. Certainly it's not what my parents did that I know of. And so here we are, we're down into Arizona, and we had stopped at a national park, and they had no openings. And it was getting on, well, it was past 6 p.m. I mean, it was getting on nighttime. It wasn't even evening. And we had stopped earlier and tried in a town before that and tried to find a hotel, and there was no hotel there that had any openings. And, you know, there were no cell phones there, so it wasn't like Dad or Mom could be on the phone calling ahead. And so we stopped, I think the next time, I think it was Tuba City. It sticks out in my head for some reason. And there was this hotel that had an opening, and Dad went in, and I will never forget him stomping back out, saying, "We are not staying in that hotel." Apparently it was really disgusting. And so by this time, it's like 8 o'clock at night, and we need to find some place to stay. And there weren't very many towns where we were at this point. And so he drove back to this national park, and he found what he felt was an appropriate camping spot there. Okay. So my father is 6'2". I look like him. I sound like him. I'm a lot like him, except he's a lot more intimidating when he needs to be, apparently. And so we set up camp. We set up our tent. We set up the table. We make dinner. I mean, we've been there for quite a while. We have our evening meal, and my mom and my sister and I are doing the dishes, and Dad is doing the rest of this, getting everything in the tent, and the ranger comes up and says, "I'm really sorry, sir, but this isn't an appropriate campsite for you to stay in. I have to ask you and your family to leave." And my father says, "Well, we can't find anywhere else to stay. There's no place else to stay. We've tried." And he says, "I'm really sorry, sir. There's no place else. There's no place else here that's open. Every single campsite is taken. This is not an appropriate campsite." And my father didn't blow up. He didn't. He just kind of, and said, "Okay." And by this time, my little sister, who's 9, is just sobbing hysterically. She's exhausted. She's terrified because where are we going to go now? And I'm not, but I wanted to, but I was a grown-up 11-year-old, And my mom just has this ugh. Yeah, she's a mother. How else can she look? And so we start breaking everything down, you know? And I'm sure my father's just fuming inside. And I think what he's thinking is, okay, we're gonna have to go pull over, hope we're safe someplace and sleep in the van tonight, you know? In a place that we are unfamiliar with. And all of a sudden, about 15 minutes later, an entire posse of Rangers comes up. And I can't even tell you how many, because they came up in their vehicles, and so their headlights are on us, and it's just this row of people. And the guy comes to me, he's like, "Sir, I gotta tell you," and I'll never forget this because I'm 11, "I just feel like shit about this." And I was like, you said a bad word in front of me. And he's like, "I just feel terrible. This is awful. I mean, you're here with your young kids. It's so late. I feel terrible." And it turns out that there was a young man who, of course, I think he was probably like 25 or 26, but he was old because I was 11. There was this guy who was motorcycling across the United States, and he had one of the biggest campsites that, for whatever reason, that was the one that was available for him. And he had found out about this happening to this family, had gone up to the Rangers and said, "Oh my God, I'll share my campsite with them." And so so we went over and set our whole campsite up and spent the next 2 days with this guy. His name was John. And we ended up, like, we didn't spend the whole time with him or anything, but like, I know my mother fed him really good breakfast every day. And I remember him taking us to this place, hiking us out to this place to do the sunset. Because he's like, "I found this great place, you gotta come see the sunset with me." And like, so he took our family to find this great place to do this sunset. And I know for a fact that for at least the next decade, my parents exchanged Christmas letters with him. I can't show his last name, I just know his first name was John, and he was really old. But he was really nice. And so that realization of, number one, those trips are like that, and you just go out and you meet people everywhere, and I love to do that, and my husband does. And then I go back to sitting in this little hole-in-the-wall Indian restaurant in a neighborhood in London 4 years ago that the hotel clerk told my husband and I to go to instead of the posh ones, which apparently is not good enough Indian food and they charge you too much. That's what the elderly Indian gentleman told us. So we're at this hole-in-the-wall Indian restaurant, and there is these two moms and their 4 little kids who then find out we're American and pepper us with questions for the better part of an hour and a half. And at the end of that night, we gave them American dollars. They'd never seen American dollars before. They were so excited. That was one of the highlights of our trip. And that has made those trips and that kind of thing that happened to us in Arizona has made me into a traveler who loves to be out and about and who loves to interact with people. And I doubt that discussion in that little London Indian restaurant will affect those kids for the rest of their lives, but it sure affected them for a while, and giving them that dollar brightened their days. And so, but that man named John on his motorcycle in that national park campsite in Arizona certainly affected our family that night, and it's definitely changed how I viewed how to interact with people and how to vacation for my life. So.
My name is Kathy Steffen, and my origin story starts with the woman who would become my mother. She, at 20, ran away from 3 engagement proposals. She grew up in Detroit, Michigan. Didn't want to marry any of them, even though her father said, "But they're such nice boys," which of course made her want to run away. So she ran away to Arizona with her girlfriend. They rented a little room in a little motor court. So people come and go, but you could rent for a little while. And while they were there, she and her friend Laura happened to look out the window and see a very handsome young man drive in. Now this man was visiting back fresh from World War II, one who was at Normandy Beach, came back home, needed some time to adjust to life back on the farm, south of here, like Franklin, Minnesota, but moved to Arizona to help his uncle who had fallen off a ladder. So it was this man who was driving into that little motor cart. And of course, the woman who would become my mother, thought he was so handsome, and so did her best girlfriend, Laura. So they flipped a coin. The woman who would become my mother won, and the minute they saw this handsome young man go to the little laundry building in the middle of the motor court, my mother gathered up, or the woman who would become my mother, gathered up some clean clothes, put them in a laundry basket, and went over to introduce herself. And apparently, that man thought she had gorgeous legs. And so, because of that coin flip, and because of her gorgeous legs, I am here today.
I'm Julie Lofdahl, and I'm going to tell you the origin of my marriage. So, I've been married once before, divorced, and was single for 4 years, and I wanted to go camping again. I love to camp. So my friend Lene Klassen said, well, I'm going on a rendezvous this weekend. You want to come with? I'm like, sure, not knowing what a rendezvous is, but it was at Murphy's Landing, so I thought it'd be fun. So she borrowed me a dress because it was dressing as fur traders. And so we do fur trade reenactment, my husband and I. So he saw me there. I didn't remember him at all because it was a wedding for a couple that were in the club that I'll eventually join. And I spent a whole day cutting up turkeys because we fed the whole camp. So that's all I remember of that rendezvous, basically, was cutting up turkeys in a borrowed dress. So then, I really liked it. I thought it was fun. These people are fun. So I went with another gal from there, from the club I met, and we went up to Grand Portage. So we drove up there, and it rained the whole time. It was a storm. We camped right on Lake Superior at the National Monument, and it rained the whole time. And my husband John was in charge of the gala. So our club would feed everybody who was there. So he got trout from the Native Americans up there, and we were cooking it under this tarp with the rain pouring in and the wind and this fire. And, you know, I looked horrible. You're crying the whole time, you know, it's just, you can't see because of the smoke. And it was even so bad that they let people sleep in the Great Hall that year because everybody's camps were washed out. Because it's not modern tenting, you tent with canvas on the ground. So, I saw John, I thought, well, he's cute and nice and, you know, all that. But we went back after that rendezvous, and then the next month there's a rendezvous at Pine City. So I go with Lene to that one. And John then said to me later, he said, well, if you were hanging around with Lene and Bob, I figured you must be pretty good. So, because he really liked them. So he talked to me, and then at that point, I was living in Minneapolis, or in Bloomington, so I met him. He called, and I said, yeah, I can go out, because he lived in Minneapolis. And so we decided to go out, and he came over to my aunt and uncle's, because I happened to be there that day staying with them. And so it was kind of fun. We had a nice time. He lies every time about what happened on that first date, right, Emily?
I believe so.
Yes.
I wasn't there.
Yes, but I tell her he lied that first date how it went. But we did good. We kept going on rendezvous. No, I was just staying with my aunt and uncle. I lived out here, so we going on rendezvous, and we eventually were pretty serious and got married and had our boys. We got married in '90 and had our boys in '92, twin boys. In their first rendezvous, they were 5 months old. So they grew up rendezvousing. So we have these twin boys, which was good in the beginning, but then they became 1.5 and 2, and we're afraid of all the guys with the big beards and the costuming. because they didn't like Santa, you know, and so so we were at Murphy's Landing, and I spent 3 rainy days in the tent because they would not go out to see anybody. But the next year they got over that, and we ended up having, call my rendezvous family my other family. We had 14 kids. The oldest was a girl, the youngest was a girl, and then there were all boys in between from age 12 down to baby. And these kids grew up with each other. And the storytelling is why I'm kind of up here, because we'd sit around the fire every night and they would hear all the stories of the canoe trips, because our club dresses in costume and goes on canoe trips in costume with period food and all that kind of stuff. And they would hear all these stories. Well, then it would change to politics. These kids are all very political. They have opinions. They are pretty much on the same wavelength and everything, but you know, they don't see each other as much now because my boys are 25. So now we're still rendezvousing, but the kids aren't as much. They're starting to come back, but now we're burying our parents. You know, so it's come this whole route where we had our babies and we grew up and everything, and now some of the kids are married, and there's no babies there yet, but we are now burying our parents or having parents in nursing homes with dementia and everything. So it's been this whole life with these people. And whenever any of us get together, it's hugs, it's family, it's, you know, it's just this story that grew from me wanting to go camping.
Thanks, Julie. Any questions for Julie?
I just have to tease her a little bit because she said, I can't go over there.
There's something about hearing other stories and you go, well, I'll tell my story. It draws you out, so it's fun to watch. Yeah. I'll tell my story. Oh, Beth, do you want to tell your story?
I will tell it.
Okay. Come on up.
I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, see what
It's kind of
happens.
fun.
Yeah.
So about 15, 16 years ago, when Steve and I decided to adopt our first, not our first child, but our first adoption, we decided to go through Bethany Christian Adoption Agency in the cities. Bethany Christian is an international adoption agency, but they're real small, and they're based out of Michigan. And at the time, like 15, 16 years ago, that was the height of Chinese adoption. So there was literally thousands and thousands of families from around the world, not just the US, but around the world adopting. And, but because of privacy reasons, when you're going through the process, they don't tell you who the other families are. But we lived in an age where forums and the internet were starting, and there was a lady that had started one on other families that were waiting to adopt from China. And so we would go on there, and if you know much about adoptions, it's, you know, there's highs and there's lows, and it's long, and we just needed the support, and we needed it in other people who knew what we were going through, who were excited with us, who had the same questions. So we went on these forums, and we started meeting. And we started getting to know each other all over the place. And then we realized that there were indicators that we could figure out who was in our group from around the world, or from around the United States. Based on what they give us in China, they give you an LID number, which is a login date. And you traveled in groups based on your login date. And so how Chinese adoptions happen is when you finally get your picture of your baby and you traveled in groups. And you traveled by adoption agency. So we knew our Bethany adoption group would go together. So, you know, it's getting closer, it's getting closer. By the time we got our pictures of our babies, we had identified, I think, I want to say we identified all 16, 17 families. Maybe there was one that we hadn't already connected with online or knew who it was. So when we went to meet with our social worker and prepared to travel, at that point, she was able to give us this list, and we're like, yeah. We had already gone out for lunch or met for supper with one family, talked on the phone to several other ones, and we had this family from around the United States of strangers that were already people that at that point we didn't love them, but we were really getting close to. And so, because we were all gonna fly these long international flights and meet up, but we were coming from all over the country, we set online, how are we gonna identify each other in the airports? Well, because we were Chinese families, it was the year of the monkey, and so we said, let's all tie yellow bandanas on our suitcases. Well, it probably doesn't take much to tell you that once we started walking in international airports, and you saw the yellow bandanas on these parents that were all waiting for their babies, we were running towards strangers, embracing complete strangers, and crying and laughing and hugging and introducing our other children that some people had with, and our husbands and wives and whoever hadn't been on the forums. And so by the time we boarded the plane, we were all sitting, talking, watching movies, laughing, sharing stories. And so as the whole several weeks happened in China and we all got our babies together, to this day we all stay in contact. We call them our family. It's our China family. It's a very special, special bond. And we got to do it a second time when we went back to get Jill. So that's our story of unique origins.